Good evening, everybody. I don't even know if this thing is working. Oh, okay, great. So my name is Carolyn Podruchny, and I'm standing in for the interim director of the Robarts Centre of Canadian Studies, Anna Hudson, who is standing in for the permanent director of the Robarts Centre, who is Gabrielle Slowey, who's currently on leave at Dartmouth College. So anyway, I'm from the history department, but also a research fellow at Robarts. I'm so happy to see such a wonderful audience today, and I hear that the conference is going incredibly well, so I'm so happy to hear that. Congratulations to the organizers who seem to be doing an amazing job. Like, I can't believe we had a live band just now. That was like amazing. So I just wanted to mention to everybody that the conference is starting to get again tomorrow with breakfast at 9:30. So without further ado, I want to introduce Bonita Lawrence, who I'm so happy to introduce, who's one of my longtime colleagues. I don't even know if you remember this, Bonita, but you were hired the same time as me. Yes, so yeah, we went to those orientation faculty sessions together. So Bonita is in race, indigeneity, and ethnicity. And her talk is going to be called Canada at 150, Where is the Truth in Reconciliation? But before I actually introduce Bonita properly, I do want to do a land acknowledgement, just acknowledging the Indigenous people who have stewarded the land, lived on the land, occupied the land, owned the land, before we came to occupy it as a university. So York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Taronta has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and also by Métis people passing through the area. So it's now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, who are the Mississauga of New Credit First Nation, and also that this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So Bonita Lawrence, who is Mi'kmaq from the East Coast, is an associate professor in the Department of Equity Studies, where she teaches primarily Indigenous studies. So she's the founding member of the undergraduate program in race, ethnicity, and indigeneity, which I gather is now called Multicultural and Indigenous Studies. So her research and publications have focused primarily on urban, non-status, and Métis identities, federally unrecognized Aboriginal communities, and also Indigenous justice. So she's the author of 2 books. Her first book was 2004, Real Indians and Others, Mixed Blood, Urban and Native People and Indigenous Nationhood. And then her more recent book is called Fractured Homeland, Federal Recognition and Algonquin Identity in Ontario. So without further ado, Bonita.
Medawalain, Nin Delwisi Bonita Lawrence, Mi'kmaq Nanin, Nuchinaq, Delewin, Lennox Island, Elsipogtog, which is just to say what she said in Mi'kmaq. This talk is not going to be heavy theoretical, and I'm so sorry it started late. I hadn't seen a former student of mine for a long time, and I didn't realize we were after the hour. And I want to, first of all, question the concept of reconciliation, and I'll also address later in the talk the call to celebrate Canada's 150th birthday and what it means in such contexts. It's a heavily fact-oriented paper. Half of you will know exactly, will say, hey, I already know this. The other half may not, and so on and so forth. But I've been subscribing to a media service for a long time addressing Indigenous issues, and when I started to write this, I pulled them all together, and the total picture was so bad that I thought, oh, that's what I got to write about. I'm going to begin with a quote from Rebecca Benson, who is a two-spirited woman working on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And her quote was, "I expect folks to understand that reconciliation is a two-way street, and we can't get to reconciliation until we have the truth part. The truth is that reconciliation, at least on the part of the federal government, which touts the term continuously, is not happening at all, least of all on Indigenous terms. Now, while some individuals, communities, and organizations are genuinely seeking reconciliation with Native peoples, and some institutions, such as universities, are at least responding to some of the calls from the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But the reality is that in so many areas, this government continues to maintain the same restrictions and inequalities that the Harper government and prior governments maintained. In so many of its practices, Canada continues to manifest colonial domination, racism, and indifference to Native suffering. And it's not meant specifically as an attack on the Trudeau government. He was a breath of fresh air after Harper, right? You know, his refusal to target Muslims in particular directly, as well as other peoples of color. And through his multicultural vision, he no doubt is serious in including Native peoples as part of the diversity that Canada is now supposed to embrace. But Native peoples aren't a multicultural group. Our realities are tied to our traditional lands. And Canada's reality is that it's unique among advanced economies for its continuous reliance on its primary sector, logging, oil and gas production, hydro development, and mining. Resource-based exports still account for 35% of Canada's exports. And Canada is the 5th largest energy producer. Unlike all other advanced economies, Canada is a net energy exporter. All other advanced economies import, right? So it's the world's leader in mineral exports. There's a few other statistics about hydropower, et cetera, but all of the minerals, oil, gas, hydro developments, and forests that account for 1/3 of Canada's exports lie on Native lands. So how can the Trudeau government extend its commitment to diversity to Native peoples when Native land is the source of Canada's wealth? And then, of course, there's the unspoken reality at the heart of all settler colonial nations. What can we do about the problem of Native people whose claim to the land is so much deeper than our own? I'm saying our inclusively. It was the particular genius of Trudeau's father that he created the multiculturalism policy in 1971, just 2 years after the statement of the Canadian government on Indian policy, known as the White Paper. After the White Paper attempted unsuccessfully to dissolve reserves and all legal categories and treaties so that Native peoples would finally become unquestionably assimilated into Canada, albeit as impoverished racial minorities. Now, what the White Paper could not accomplish in 1969, the multiculturalism policy has accomplished indirectly. Native people are still hemmed in by a variety of laws and policies created to control them as obstacles to Canada's national interests in a resource-based economy, so that Canada continue to obtain the wealth that comes from Native lands. And ideologically, the residue of centuries of being considered as obstacles to progress, so that the land can be appropriated by force, has framed how both the government and large numbers of Canadians have seen, and in many cases continue to see, Native people. So that colonial domination, racism, and government indifference still remain central to how Native peoples are treated. I'm sorry to be reading, but I will never get through this unless I stick to the subject. So that's still the case, but the multiculturalism policy has coded Native peoples, in the public mind at least, as just another minority group. And just as the idea of multiculturalism hides the histories of exclusion policies and internment practices that have been directed and are still directed in the form of security certificates, it suggests that a policy of reconciliation can erase a history of settler state colonialism. So I spent a long time preparing for this keynote, as I say, through this multiple clippings. The cumulative picture demonstrates the violence, racism, and sheer lack of human rights that Native peoples in Canada continue to face. So I'm going to begin with the land, because that really is the foundation, which means beginning with tar sands, oil and gas pipelines. And here many of you are at least as cognizant as I am, but I'm just going to quickly try and, do the picture. But I also wanted to start with a quote from West Moberly Chief Roland Wilson concerning hydro development in the Peace River. If the relationship with Indigenous peoples is so important, why isn't anybody listening to us, right? And the sheer figures would overwhelm, so I'm going to try in 20 seconds to deal with, the bare minimum of details. The Indigenous Anti-Pipeline Treaty Alliance has been going on for quite a while now to coordinate opposition against the Trans Mountain Project, Enbridge's Line 3 expansion, the Energy East Pipeline, and Keystone XL. I had to look up some of these because, in all honesty, I'd heard about them, but I didn't know enough about them. Kinder Morgan, Trans Mountain Pipeline, with far bigger capacity than any of the other pipelines, would position Canada to be the biggest oil producer in the Americas, nearly tripling current capacity from Alberta to BC, and the number of tankers shipping oil from BC to Washington State would increase from 5 to 34 tankers through the narrow and circuitous routes of the Salish Sea, the inland route. Oil spills, of course, there would be disastrous. The Keystone XL and the Enbridge line are about massively increasing the amount of oil brought directly into the United States from Alberta by pipeline, and its further penetration throughout the US at a tremendous risk to contaminating underground waters. The Energy East Pipeline one, that one I find quite interesting. Same risk of contaminating aquifers. It involves 500 kilometers of pipeline through 6 provinces, bringing 1.1 million barrels of oil per day from Alberta and Saskatchewan to New Brunswick so that they could target India. That's the ultimate goal of the Energy East Pipeline, if it gets approved. Approval through 6 provinces, is one thing. So what's happening at the source of all these pipelines, which would make Canada one of the primary oil producers in the world? Since 1999, more than $200 billion has been invested in Alberta's tar sands. It fueled a multi-year boom with a planned 6-fold increase since the 90s to 2020. Investments, however, hit a peak in 2012. There's a lot of concerns in the oil industry about tar sands. Apparently, direct oil production and fracking are much more economic, which means that we can expect further fracking wherever oil shales are present: Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, southern Ontario, southern Quebec, where they've actually put a moratorium, and of course the Maritimes. And bullying and threats from the government accompany each stage of resistance to Indigenous resistance to pipeline and fracking. The next energy resource is hydro development. January 2017, the federal court dismissed First Nations challenges to the Site C Dam on the Peace River. Excuse me for lisping. I have a false tooth in there. The Prophet River and West Moberly First Nations argued that flooding 83 kilometers of the Peace River Valley to make way for a hydro project infringes on their constitutionally protected treaty rights. Lawyers for the federal government and BC Hydro countered that decisions about treaty rights should be determined in court, not by cabinet. The courts agreed and dismissed the case without ever ruling on treaty rights. Instead, they ruled the federal government is allowed to issue permits for projects like Site C without first discovering whether they are violating treaty rights, which really is a direct reversal of already impotent court cases like Haida, Takla River, and another one recently that everybody was excited about, but they all still say you have the right to be consulted, but not the right to say no, right? So that's consultation for you. Site C flooding, of course, will render First Nations actions on the land impossible, as well as farmers and ranchers. The Mikisew Cree First Nation is worried that the Site C will dry out the Wood Buffalo National Park, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. BC Hydro says the dam would be large enough to power 450,000 homes. The important thing is they don't need the power for between 20 or 40 years. So it's geared simply for export, right? Again, those of you who are into resource development are saying, tell us something new so far. But I think a lot of people aren't really clear on a lot of it, which is why I'm going over it all. In Labrador, Muscat Falls project, and that's supposedly to get Newfoundland off of coal-fired facilities. They're going to have massive transmission lines, underwater connections to Newfoundland, and also to Nova Scotia. While saying that it's about ending coal fire, they're also saying that the mainland grid will allow connection to the US to sell more hydro, right? And of course, the flooding would cause methyl mercury contamination to the downstream Lake Melville Marine Estuary, which is why the Inuit protested for a couple of weeks last year and got an agreement that a feasibility study about removing all of the vegetation for the 101 square miles flooded, and also the topsoil from the reservoir itself, would stop any mercury contamination. No feasibility study has been done. Nalcor is going ahead with a partial clearance. Experts are saying it will increase mercury by 300%. The Nunavut government, representing the Inuit and Labrador, is now pushing to try and make the process correct. But again, this is about selling more power. Which brings us, of course, to Grassy Narrows and Wabaseemoong, First Nations. I laugh when white people do this. But when you're trying to read fast, you're like, what? I don't really laugh, but but yeah, the Grassy Narrows project, most of you know 9,000 kilometers of mercury discharge between 62 and 70, 50 more barrels of mercury dumped illegally after that. It's taken 40 years for any cleanup to get started, and the Ontario government and the federal government always said that trying to clean it up would make it worse, which has been absolutely disproved. So now they're starting to clean it up. Also, a Japanese team and a hunger strike from the chief of the Grassy Narrows Reserve and a visit by David Suzuki caused the federal government, provincial government, to actually look at the Mercury Disability Board, which was established in 1985 as part of an out-of-court settlement about the mercury contamination. To date, the government has limited eligibility to those showing signs of advanced debilitating poisoning. Only a quarter of applications are received. The Japanese, who have experienced mercury poisoning more than anybody else, have said, if the whole community has eaten the fish that has been contaminated and 90% are showing signs of mercury poisoning, they're all victims. And they're advising Canada to stop looking for proof of who is sick and to actually start treating people and to try and bring medical facilities closer to them so that they don't have to drive 3 hours to Winnipeg for treatment. And I've addressed the most crucial recent developments here. I haven't foregrounded the ongoing struggles over forestry, which many BC First Nations, as well as the Barrier Lake Algonquins and many others have been engaged in, or the Ring of Fire, as they call it, the chromium and other rare earth metals and platinum in Northern Ontario, the diamonds, all of the basic minerals, base metal, gold, that are all affecting northern communities. Northern Saskatchewan in particular, 12% uranium. I used to be a geologist. It's the richest deposits of uranium in the world. Maybe that's why I'm focusing on the land so much. You can't complain about uranium in Saskatchewan. No, seriously, people are threatened just for talking about the burial of nuclear waste, right? So, and of course, talking about Northern Ontario, Meadow Lake, all of the places where only Native people live as a burial place for nuclear waste. If tar sands, pipelines, hydro development, forestry, mining, and being targeted for the burial of nuclear waste are all happening on Native lands as if they truly are terra nullius, empty lands, where only Native people will have to deal with the repercussions, we must ask ourselves about the social realities. If Native land is desired and Native people's life on the land is constantly being viewed as expendable, maybe it's not surprising that in other areas, government policies continue to treat Native peoples as expendable, all the while talking about reconciliation. And the figures are telling. Now, those of you who are into the social issues will say, I know about this. But, United Nations Quality of Life Index ranked Canada 6th in the world. First Nations are ranked at 63rd. So 6th and 63rd, that's the difference. INAC funding increases have been capped at 2% for the past 20 years. So there's about 10,000 Indigenous students on a waiting list to attend post-secondary institutions. And that's just reserve-based. Because if you're urban, your chances of getting on a band list for education drop even further because it's such a long waiting list anyway. Disparity in public school funding, the provinces pays 6,000 per child for reserve schools, 10,000 per child in public schools. Less than 10% of Indigenous peoples have a university education, 1/3 of the national rate of 27%, while the government spends now over $700 million a year on official languages. It spends only $5 million a year on 50-odd Indigenous languages, like you have to divide up 5 million. Used to be 1 million, now it's 5 million. And finally, recognized Indigenous peoples represent 4.3% of the Canadian population, but 24% of the prison population, because we have to take provincial as well as federal. They keep underestimating, saying 17% in federal prisons, but what about, I mean, the Western provinces where 100% of the people in provincial prisons are Native. So we're talking 24%. And it's also measured in the difference in the quality of life, healthcare, and social services. I'm going to talk about drinking water because everybody knows about the drinking water, but I was interested in finding out why. I mean, close to 100 communities on boil water advisories. The government cleaned up 12 and then 14 more went on the list. So it's really not happening. And the two issues are 20 years of underfunding, 2% cap on spending, which meant that INAC raided its infrastructure budget to direct it to everything else that they couldn't make ends meet on, which meant, of course, no homes built, but it also meant that they accepted tremendous underbidding from unscrupulous or incompetent contractors. So many were undersized, many were poorly designed, others used inappropriate technology for northern communities. Others maintained complex parts with a zero budget for maintenance, let alone training people to maintain. So those ones failed too. Because of these decades of underfunding, now 1/3 of all First Nations, 1/3 of the 600 and some odd First Nations are at medium to high risk of their water failing. Now, within the past 5 years, plants are being built a little better, which means less people going to school and less people having housing built. So they're better designed within the past 5 years. However, provincial maintenance budgets are nothing like First Nations maintenance budgets. So they will fail too. In the last budget, the government committed $1.8 billion over 5 years. They'd have to do that for 20 years, precisely for the underfunding for the past 20 years. But we know that long-term solutions are not what elected politicians do, especially not when it's Native people, right? There's other ways that I think you have to take into account. The comprehensive claims policy, touted as modern-day treaties, never involves relinquishing any lands, limits land claim negotiations to only what Canada control, and denies the centuries of wealth Canada stole in establishing settlements. So you get 200 million when Canada made 100 billion off of the same land, right? Canada will criminalize any assertions of Indigenous rights, even when the Supreme Court has recognized the rights. Canada spent $15 million to have the Department of Fisheries and Oceans criminalize one Native community for trying to fish for lobster, without submitting to Canada's regulatory plan, which the Supreme Court's indicated they didn't have to do. So what about social issues? What's Canada doing here? And I know you're probably all fed up with already hearing it, but it's going to get worse. Sorry. But I mean, the talk of reconciliation is so overwhelming. People think something good is happening, right? Canada is willing to run up considerable legal debt, fighting to prevent or bypass legal decisions that would mean a more equitable treatment of Native peoples. And it's all how you treat those who are in deep ways extraneous. For example, in November 2016, a Manitoba judge ruled that if sexual assault survivors are not required to prove the perpetrator's intent, then it's inconsistent that residential school survivors should have to prove their abuser's intent to receive compensation under the independent assessment process. Now, in the residential school settlement, there is a basic amount that you get per year in residential schools. I can't remember what it is, $8,000 a year, something like that. But if you have been abused, There's a second independent assessment process. And much of it involves, can you prove it? And of course, you're being infantilized immediately because you're trying to remember what happened when you were 6. And was the person's really intent if they touched you up? Was it done with the intent to really abuse? Were they not just holding you to comfort you? This sort of thing. You don't have to do that in sexual assault cases, right? And when survivors are reliving this in the independent assessment process, they aren't told that the federal government has located 5,315 alleged abusers. They were required to do so as part of the settlement, residential schools settlement. They weren't tracked down to have criminal charges laid. They were tracked down to see if they would take part to determine if survivors should get settlements. In other words, they would testify as to their vision of it, right? And that would be used to determine, I didn't mean to. So intent matters, right? 44,050 have refused to participate because they're afraid it'll result in criminal charges, and it's not compulsory. So 800 people have done that. So nowadays, after years of court cases before the class action suit, fewer than 50 people have ever been convicted in crimes related to the schools, while 33,712 residential school survivors have been compensated. 4,278 are still on the books to see if, to testify about it. And they're not saying how many get turned down, right? Because they can't prove it. Because the survivor, the abuser showed up and gave his story. Not surprising, Canada's fighting this Manitoba decision. If residential school survivors were brought into line with sexual assault survivors, and Lord knows that isn't an even playing field either, but at least you don't have to prove intent. From Canada's perspective, we can't have equal treatment for Native and non-Native in a settler nation. In November 2016, after much talk of reconciliation, the federal government pressed for a Toronto judge to throw out the class action suit for Ontario survivors of the 60s scoop. That's only one of 4 that have going through the courts, but the Ontario one was launched much earlier. So it's been the most advanced. BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba are also introducing class action suits. It has to be done provincially because you have different agencies and times involved. And they had to have the federal government, they could not address abuse in foster homes. They had to say loss of culture, and it was not because of specific welfare agencies, it was because Canada gave up fiduciary responsibility. They had control of Native kids and they handed them over to child welfare agencies. That was the basis of the court case. At one point, Canada said, just throw it out. We cannot judge. And it's interesting because they use the term reconciliation. We cannot judge reconciliatory and abusive or responsibility judgments from the present projected to the past, which was 50 years ago. The judge refused to throw it out of court and actually settled in just, I think, a couple of months ago. Now, of course, comes the question of compensation. Canada won't fight it any further once the judge agreed that the class action suit was just. However, the question is, they're asking for $1.6 billion in compensation, and the question is, what is Canada going to fight for? And how are they going to narrow eligibility? Any of you who've been survivors of the 60 scoop or have known many survivors of the 60 scoop, there's about 30%, I would say, are totally destabilized, the ones that went to abusive homes. A class action suit could help people so much in proceeding with their lives. But anyway, that's what Canada's doing there. So, the one that I think people are perhaps aware of is the Cindy Blackstock, First Nations Caring Society. 2003 challenges how child welfare on reserves is so much underfunded compared to child welfare in the larger issue. And this is part of how kids keep getting taken. Nearly half the children in foster care nowadays are Indigenous. Most are under care of the welfare system. There's more Indigenous children in state custody now than there were at the height of the residential school era, right? And the tribunal took 10 years to start, but after 3 years in January, they ruled that Canada was, it's a legally binding agreement. Canada was found to be racially discriminating against 163,000 First Nations children, were ordered to stop. Canada did not apply. The Human Rights Tribunal issued 2 non-compliance orders against the Canadian government. Now, complying with the orders means an immediate investment of a minimum of $155 million for Native child welfare. It spent more than $500,000 since 2016 on legal fees. This is a reconciliatory government, right? Since that decision. Minister Carolyn Bennett pledged to have some $635 million over 5 years in funding for the child welfare. However, only 71,000 will be admitted this year. The remainder is backloaded to 2019 and 2020 after the next federal election. So it's fair to say that money will never be spent. Meanwhile, the public will believe that all $635 million has been spent and will blame First Nations as ungrateful degenerates who are swindling the public purse when they continue to ask for parity after getting all this money. So it's very, very deceitful. Now, the federal government was ordered to appear before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington after 2 non-compliance orders. It may finally force Ottawa to immediately overhaul the system. They're starting hearings now in April 2017. They've also ruled that Canada has to fully implement Jordan's Principle, which has to do with social services that children on reserves can access vis-a-vis social services in the provincial system, right? So they're also going to be looking at that. Healthcare is another issue. For years, doctors have asserted that the federal government woefully underfunds Indigenous healthcare, leading to race-based discrepancies in the quality of medical services available to Native people, especially on reserves. And it becomes especially apparent with respect to suicide epidemics. The response of the federal government since the first large-scale suicide epidemic at Elsipogtog in early 1990s, where Native people were told to drive to the nearest town to get services, to the scandal at Wapakika, where after 16 people killed themselves a few years back and their health services program had run down, they felt that there was a suicide pact among the kids, asked Canada for some funding to boot it up again. Canada refused, said we will look for some funding and get back to you. 2 girls killed themselves. A private donor offered $318 million, has already spent $80 million on the community. Canada coughed up the money they refused to do before the girls died, right? Indigenous health experts now assert that suicide epidemics in Native communities are not a mental health issue. They are a colonization issue. They're responses to terrible intergenerational and ongoing pain that's penetrated through communities. They state that what communities need are to rebuild their caring connections, to empower their children, to be able to have meaningful roles in their communities. None of this can be done when communities are little more than fly-in outposts, northern communities, fly-in outposts that contain none of the infrastructure that's normative in non-Native communities, and that comes from the wealth taken from their lands. Now, I've been to Kirkland Lake, which was a white settlement flown in to replace Native people and to mine, a gold mine there. They have nothing left down there. It's all gone to Toronto. But they have 2 Tim Hortons. They have a recreation center. They have roads. None of that is offered to northern Native communities. And they need to rebuild their sense of spirituality and the deep cultural values that residential schools were created to destroy. But loss of culture is not part of the independent assessment process. So it's all linked. At every level, it's all linked. The questions that underlie the massive inequities relating to clean water, children's services, and all forms of healthcare in crisis between reserve communities and non-Native Canadians is that no hospitals, no crisis centers, no recreational facilities, indeed no roads, except forestry roads for access to northern Native communities, are ever built. Even past epidemics like the TB epidemic in the far north, they flew people south. The idea of building any infrastructure in the north is something that Canada will not consider. We have to consider that the refusal to build any real infrastructure in the north except for the benefit of mining projects or forestry roads. It underlines the reluctance of the federal government to see Native people as anything but expendable. And of course, as peoples have to continually relocate south for education, for health care, for everything that isn't available in northern communities in particular, then they become unviable. And then you get some right-wing jerk, pardon my language, suggesting that, well, shouldn't Native people who live in small communities be expected to move elsewhere? Because their communities, you can't expect us to build infrastructure for 300 people, right? You don't have to worry about that if people can stay in their communities without having to leave for all of these things. So they create the problem and then answer the problem with the suggestion that these communities are inherently inviable. I know, because my sister asked me that, and you know, she's always stronger in her Mi'kmaq identity than I have, and she said, what about northern communities? She's never been to university, right? So I realized that's a big question for people, right? If you absolutely remove anything that's viable, people leave, then what's left is not viable, right? Only resource extraction, of course, is viable in the north. So you have to consider Canada has the highest suicide rate of Indigenous people in the world, according to Shireen Razak, and I trust her eminently. With 24% of Native people in prison, it's got the highest Indigenous incarceration rate in the world, higher than Australia, right? Which is second highest, which usually thought of as the highest. And I think it ties right in with the fact that Canada, of all advanced G7 nations, is the only one where a third of its economy is based in resources, and the only one that relies on exporting rather than importing energy. Reading report after report dominating these issues, I'm forced to conclude that in the same way as Muslims who are detained under security certificates because they might in the future manifest terrorist tendencies, Native peoples in Canada constitute what Giorgio Agamben refers to as a state of exception that is central to Canada's assertions of sovereignty, being confined to a condition where the full brunt of laws is continuously asserted on communities, where a separate legal system and a complete lack of access to any of the normal conditions of life that are common in advanced capitalist societies results in the travesties that I've spent the past half hour talking about. So the reconciliation structure that Canada has in the past year asserted are those that don't trouble those structural arrangements. The inquiry into missing and murdered women. I was reading on Facebook 2 nights ago. I shouldn't read Facebook at night. It keeps me up all night. But I turned it on, and I had already heard, you know, when they first said it was such a short-term inquiry, rather than actually reopening the cases of women who are missing and examining police indifference plus police actual treatment of Indigenous women, right? Without doing any of that, you're really just creating another report. And they called off a report, they called off a visit recently, so a whole lot of families that were going to testify suddenly found out about a couple of days before they were going to book their tickets that, no, that's not going to happen. And they said they were giving up on it. A lot of other women have complained that even though we gave in our names, no one has contacted us. So that, you know, which had potential, is being squandered. You know, we already know that it's a problem, right? Is it not going to do something, right? The other one is that Trudeau pledged to host formal bilateral meetings with Indigenous leaders from the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit Tapiriset Kanatami, and the Métis National Council each year to help draft policies on shared priorities. Similar meetings with relevant cabinet ministers will also take place twice a year. Notably, he hasn't included the Native Women's Association of Canada, which is more about equity than governance, as well as the Indigenous Peoples Assembly of Canada, which represents off-reserve and non-status Indians. So arguably, he's pledged to meet with the top level of Indigenous societies, those that are already dependent on the federal government, because if, on the average, First Nations have 0.01% of their former lands. And if any of you didn't know, you could, aside from Nunavut, you could take all the reserves in Canada and it wouldn't fill 1/2 of the Navajo Big Reservation in Arizona. So that's how little land Native people have. In hosting discussions with these leaders, he's dealing with the people who are already accountable to the government and not to the communities because of the structure of the Indian Act. or in the case of the Inuit, because their communities need resources and therefore are dependent on the federal government. So we're unlikely to see any real challenges. They're also the ones who believe most firmly in reconciliation because it can maybe line a few pockets. I've seen some really dedicated chiefs, you know, so I don't want to just like, the chiefs are, but you know, you're talking with the people who are dependent on government funding. So he's also promised $10 million in funding for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba, which is being set up to commemorate residential school survivors. And so the only forms of reconciliation that the Trudeau government, or any government, because, you know, I'm not sort of, like, I enjoy Trudeau more than Harper, but they're the same in terms of Indigenous peoples. The only forms of reconciliation that are being talked about are those that will not disturb. And here I'm going to be all traditional Marxist, superstructure and substructure. No, I won't go there. The ones that will not disturb the underlying conditions, you know, that's all that reconciliation can actually do. Which brings us to the Canada's 150 celebrations, because that is part of the talk. Some of you may have read this beautiful article by Erica Violet Lee and Hayden King. They referred to Canada's 150th birthday celebrations as the Wigwam Conspiracy, that 150 years of progress is only made possible by emphasizing fabricated notions of Indigenous primitivity, right? If Indigenous peoples are primitive, then Canada has all this progress. And also being eternally static and stuck in the past. And they note that both of those impressions permit the Canada 150th party to take place without critical reflection on colonialism's past and present. And I'm going to quote some of their words because they write so beautifully. There have always been divergent stories of home in Canada. Mythic, pluralistic, glowing hearts on one hand, oppressive home on native land on the other. In the former story, symbols dominate. Empty wigwams and teepees because they don't speak back to paternalism. Sacred stories removed from their keepers to prevent carrying the memories of our worlds into the future. And Indigenous peoples themselves as tokens, because tokens offer consent. In the latter story, the notion of home is one of appropriation, poison, and exile. Yet sacred all the same, because Indigenous realities are not so easily excised or obscured. Indigenous cultures, art, and people do not exist for entertainment or gross domestic product, nor to soothe reconciliatory anxiety. Beyond the pretense of inclusion, our resistance remains on our lands, bodies, and homes are worthy of care. A galaxy that colonization will never appropriate or erase. Home is carried on our backs and in our hearts. Other Indigenous activists, artists, and storytellers, Christy Belcourt, Maria Campbell, Tanya Capo, Isaac Murdoch, they started #Resistance150, which is an interesting project where they really have been gathering together people's stories of resistance, including, I'm way too busy organizing to respond to this. But one of the things that I really liked, one person said, was, resistance requires sacrifice, it requires unrest, it requires prioritizing love and rage for our people and the lands and waters. So to come to the crux of the matter, if clearly the truth of reconciliation is that reconciliation cannot take place in a settler colonial nation that relies on Indigenous lands for a third of its exports, how are we to proceed at this 150th anniversary of the formal imposition of Canada as a nation on Indigenous lands? First of all, I believe it's important to be clear that reconciliation cannot happen in a settler colonial state, and not just in an abstract way, but in a state that relies so heavily on Indigenous lands and resources. Cannot happen. And to believe that it can, and to not call down as cynical the people who say that, right? Because to believe that it can is to open yourself up to precisely the multicultural vision of Canada as a place for justice for all can take place regardless of the economic foundations of the country. And here I'm thinking of 90% of my students. Even though in the Department of Equity Studies, we have the most progressive students in the university, right? It's a very pleasant place to teach. And so, yeah, to not engage in pipe dreams. And Glenn Coulthard, the supreme wisdom master, which many students and faculty members regard him as, his words modeled on the insights of Fanon are extremely relevant, that in colonial context, there's two aspects of resistance that are needed. Absolutely two aspects. One is physical, protect the lands, resist resource extraction that poisons homelands. The second is the ideological resistance, challenging racism, challenging the lies about indigeneity that are central in celebrating 150th birthday of a settler nation. To assert Indigenous knowledges, to assert Indigenous epistemologies and languages as central, to refuse to be pathologized for the anger that injustice raises, to challenge legislation such as the Indian Act and its legacy of racial division, and to a sense turn our backs on the way that Canada tries to enlist us into believing that terms like reconciliation, without in any way relinquishing the land that is its wealth and its power base, can actually happen. So we see over and over again, anyone who attempts to resist the demands of corporations to protect ancestral lands are challenging a central aspect of Canada's economic interests. They're not just challenging the settler state in terms of this is our land, not yours, how dare you occupy it. They're challenging its economic interests as well, and they will inevitably be criminalized. As the people at Elsipogtog were for challenging the fracking, you name it. Right? Those are the first that come to mind. But yeah, anywhere where anybody challenges resource extraction, they are criminalized. And the military continues to study our actions and plan counterinsurgent tactics. So resistance for some, and here I'm thinking of those of us in academia, should be to support those criminalized by helping provide funds for bail, by protesting their imprisonment, and by everywhere challenging governments who would label them as criminal by upholding their actions as heroic and not criminal. Resistance for others is to deconstruct the meaning of Canada's 150th birthday, to call for Canada to value Indigenous peoples as worthy of access to equitable treatment on par with that which other Canadians enjoy, in terms of infrastructure especially. And it's to recognize that Canada's wealth is built on Native poverty, that the stories that Canada tells itself have nothing to do with our real stories, and that, to paraphrase Erica, Violet Lee, and Hayden King, our lands, however poisoned, are still sacred, and that we carry that sacredness with us, that homes that we carry on our backs and the stories that maintain us are in fact rooted everywhere in the land. Walaleak, Nogamak. I don't know if that's 728. Not bad.
I think we have time for some questions ahead of time. So there's a mic at the back as well, or people just want to shout it out.
Can we get people to go to the mic? We probably need it for the recording.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
he did, yeah.
The organizers are on top of everything.
Thing working? I'm First Nation. I'm from James Bay, and I've been to Kirkland Lake. I was there a couple of years ago. I know the area, Kirkland Lake and Kapuskasing, up Highway 17, north of Highway 17. In Kirkland Lake, we don't have any multiculturalism. We don't have mosques. We don't have Hindu temples. We don't have any of that. It's not multicultural. And also 90% of Toronto are immigrants, or descendants of immigrant settlers.
90% now?
90%.
Used to be 75.
75?
We've gone up.
Well, I
Yeah.
heard it was 90%.
So yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. I'm a residential school survivor, and I got my settlement and I got my common experience payment, but I don't have time to discuss all that. The residential school settlement agreement was the largest court settlement in the history of Canada, a class action lawsuit, and there was an independent assessment process involved there. And first there was the alternative dispute resolution process, and then they changed it to the independent assessment process. If you were in a residential school, you got 10 years for the first year and $3,000 for each year after that. That's how it worked out. The apology, there was also an apology, a residential school apology from the Prime Minister. In 2008, the Prime Minister of Canada apologized on behalf of Canadians for residential school abuses. There was a lot of topics you discussed there, but I also want to discuss the Louis Ariel Rebellion. The Louis Ariel Rebellion was Red River Rebellion. Was more like assertion of Métis rights and Métis rights. I wouldn't call it a rebellion. I would call it assertion of Métis rights. They were fighting for their Métis rights, and Louis Ariel was hanged in 1885 for exercising his rights as a Métis, and he had mixed ancestry. He was also Cree and French. And also, you were talking about the 150 years of Confederation. We won't be celebrating that as First Nation people. We call that a celebration of colonialism, or it's also a colonial mind-setting celebration. So we don't celebrate Canada Day, July 1st. We're also a distinct people. First Nations people are distinct. Métis people are distinct. Red River Métis are distinct people, because we didn't come from Holland, or we didn't come from Greece, or any other of those other countries on the other side of the ocean. We're distinct people. We've always been here. On this land, this territory. We call this land, we call Canada. And it's always been like that. So we also have border crossing rights, what they call the Jay Treaty. I was in the States a couple months ago. I went to Michigan, came back across the border, and they didn't give me a hard time going over there. But when I came back, they asked me, how come you don't carry a Canadian passport? So I told them I'm not a Canadian, So they gave me a hard time, because what happened was Indigenous people were not allowed to vote until 1960, unless they enfranchised, meaning that they had to renounce their native identity and become Canadian citizens. So that's what happened way back in. Prior to Bill C-31, when that's because of the Indian Act system, a colonial legislation. I never went to university. I don't have any university education. I went to high school, played junior hockey in Sault Ste. Marie. I had a great year there. And I have my friend here. She graduated here 2 years ago. She's got a master's degree from York University. I spoke here about 5 times, maybe 6 times. I spoke at Professor Victoria Freeman's history class. Spoke there about 5 times, 6 times. And also want to say that we have inherent rights to the land. Treaty rights, Aboriginal rights, under Section 35 of the Constitution. They're all in the Constitution in Section 35. And those are special rights. We have special status. I think you were also talking about the special land claims policy and the comprehensive land claims policy. The treaty territories fall under specific land claims policy, the other anything that's not treaty land falls under a comprehensive land claims policy in Ottawa. Those are the 2 land claims policies that are under federal jurisdiction. And you probably heard about the 2010 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We're we're waiting for that to be implemented by the federal government. I don't know if that's going to happen, but we're waiting for a response from the federal government on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. RCAP report, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. It's sitting on a shelf in Ottawa somewhere, and it was announced in 2006, I think. In 2006, we had the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People report, and it was never implemented. It's sitting on the shelf in Ottawa somewhere, and maybe the same thing is going to happen to the
Require.
reconciliation, the 94 calls to action on reconciliation. They could be sitting on a shelf too, but we don't know. We don't know.
And the inquiry into missing and murdered
Yeah,
women.
and the missing murdered Indigenous woman,
Yeah.
also. Yeah. Contraband tobacco, Indigenous tobacco. I have some friends who own some smoke shacks on a reserve back on the Six Nations, and in Akwesasne, and they're being harassed by the authorities, because their contraband label, their tobacco is being labeled, indigenous tobacco is being labeled as contraband. But we have an inherent right to sell tobacco, and they have no business telling us you can't sell tobacco on our own land. So to me, that's an infringement of our inherent rights to self-determination in Article 3 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Again, you were talking about chronically funded Native communities.
Where are you from in James Bay? Which community are you
Yeah.
from?
Yeah, education is chronically underfunded. Economic development, all those programs on the reserve, education, health, all those programs on the reserve are all chronically funded. And the other thing is, I keep hearing people say, or the Canadian Taxpayers Federation says, those are taxpayers' dollars, when in fact those dollars are generated from indigenous lands and resources. And we need to have revenue sharing agreements with the provinces in order to benefit.
Is the hospital taxpayers' money? Is the hospital taxpayers' money?
Hospital?
Is Medicare taxpayers' money? It's all taxpayers' money,
Yeah,
but they separate them.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Only Indians are our taxpayers' money. Don't mind the Indian label.
Well,
Only First Nations are.
well, we're tax exempt. First Nations
yeah.
people are tax exempt. We're the only ones who are tax exempt. So I think that's about all I have to say. Again, chronically underfunded programs, they're still, because of the Indian Act system, it's a colonial system of government. Thank you.
Thanks for your words. I just come from Coast Salish territory, so good to learn about the unique elements of Canadian white supremacist colonialism here. And I do similar research as the topic of your talk, and I'm giving a talk tomorrow on Canada 150 and what I call the anniversary of denial. And I specifically look from a settler perspective at cultural policy, so looking at how Canada perpetuates, through multiculturalism, as you pointed out, how it perpetuates this myth of inclusion, and how it uses events like the Olympics or Canada 150 to essentially, ironically, perpetuate erasure while it's creating the mask of lifting up Indigenous people. You've given a really direct and full frontal assessment of the state of colonialism. I've found that, and I've been doing this.
I left a lot out.
Yeah,
I only had 45 minutes.
a good survey, a good kick at it. And I've been doing settler redress activism from within settler communities for a long time, and I'm really only now getting a sense of like the depth of colonialism. That I used to think that colonialism was something that happened 50 years ago. It ended with the 60s scoop or the residential school closures in the 80s, or da 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 da. But what you're saying is that clearly colonialism is highly functioning, and just curious if you have observations around how you, not necessarily through public talks, but your perceptions of Canadian society, how we can collectively illuminate the fact that colonialism is quite healthy and functioning in Canadian society, you know, as Trudeau has his hand over his heart. And also, maybe if you have a thought on the threat of post-colonial theory.
Yeah. It's difficult in terms of, I was just talking with a colleague of mine, which is why we started late, right? Who, you know, going to university, teaching at Thunder Bay. And whenever I go to Winnipeg or whenever I go to Saskatoon, you know, the racism is so raw. And I mean, I talked about being in a bathroom with another woman, and a white person walked in, and I mean, I'm you know, not very visible, but she just looked so nervous, right? So it's very, I think that you know, it's hard to talk to settlers as a settler. It may be fine in Toronto, right? Which in some ways the racism is blunted because there's a lot of other targets as well, right? You know, in Toronto than you know, in Thunder Bay or in James Bay, you know, well, not James Bay itself, but, you know, along the, en route. So I can't, it's hard to answer to that very easily. The second part of your question, though, was one I can't recall what it was. What was the second part again?
Just the preponderance of post-colonial theory.
Oh, yeah. I have, I would suggest, have you read Jody Bird's The Transitive Empire? Read it. I say that because her grasp of post-colonial theory is so intense, and the French philosophers and you name it. I think it all diverts from a recognition of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism isn't part of post-colonial theory. Some aspects of it may be useful for some people to talk about some aspects of identity issues. I had a Cree student who, when she moved to Toronto, you know, found that some aspects of, you know, various theorists were useful just for describing a personal set of circumstances. But it really, I don't think, is particularly useful. And Jody Bird extols how it isn't from a point of view of somebody who really is very well versed, which I'm not. I've read enough to say that my entire PhD was spent in scribbling all the margins, saying, where are Native people? Where are Native people? Where are Native people, right? I learned against the grain, right? So yeah, I think that's, it's not particularly very useful. And I really do think in terms of, that I think supports is a huge role that, as I say, settlers need to play, because anybody challenging anything is going to get arrested. Right, and the ways, I keep thinking of, you know, Eskanabinich, Burnt Church, right? You know, where all these guys are out there in dories and being ridden down by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and there's Herb Dollywell saying, these are criminals. You know, we can't tolerate challenges to law and order. So I really think that there's a, you know, the support role as settlers is probably a central one. So I don't know if that helps.
Hi, my name is Abu, and I really have very, I mean, from a very personal space, I'm asking you this question. So I am here a new migrant, like 5 years back I came in here. So the literature that I was provided with before coming into Canada, really there was nothing of mention of, you know, what does it mean, or is, I mean, the picture does not really reveal anything about Indian, Métis, or Aboriginal people or First Nations. And I mean, this is maybe the third, fourth time I have encountered really, like, you know, I mean, an Indigenous person, maybe 2 or 3 in the same day. I mean, having said that, but my understanding is in the entire literature, this has been concealed as if they have been erased from memory. I mean, and this does not reveal anything whatsoever. What literature we're talking about? Is it colonial, post-colonial, whatever studies we go through? We don't actually really see the representation. my research really concentrated on representation. So I was kind of curious as to know, what's really going on.
In terms of representation?
Exactly, yes, thank you.
Well, I mean, media representation. I don't know if it's really changed since the Gustafson Lake thing, where they actually said Indians shooting at Mounties, like, right? Which was really cowboys and Indians, right? Media pictures. I think that, again, I'm talking about the media here as in the newspapers. They never talk about the tobacco issue. They never talk about the criminalization of tobacco. But more than that, in 1990, two communities, Ganasatagi and Ganawage, two Mohawk communities in Quebec. I don't know if you've heard about the Oka crisis, as they call it. Watch a film by Alanisa Bomsawan, Kanasataki, 270 Years of Resistance. The interesting thing at that time, and my mother recorded everything. She recorded all of it. So I remember reading it after she died, looking at all her videos that she had recorded. Because during that time, for basically 71 days, two communities were protesting the expansion of a golf course. Well, one was protesting the expansion of a golf course onto sacred burial grounds. The other one was blocking the Mercier Bridge into Montreal in support because a Quebec police officer was killed. And they knew that once that happened, everything would come down on them. And it was a question whether the Quebec police moved in en masse and in the firing. It might even have been friendly fire, we don't know. But anyway, at that time, the media covered everything. And it was so interesting because Haudenosaunee people, there's six nations that are part of the Iroquois Confederacy, and they aren't part of the Assembly of First Nations. They're part of a confederacy at Onondaga, and yet the communities in Quebec have their own longhouses and traditional things. So the media were baffled. They were all reporting and they're saying, for one thing, Ellen Gabriel, this woman, a woman is leading the negotiations with Canada, and this whole delegation has come from Onondaga in the US. Who are they? And where's the Assembly of First Nations? Like, they were panicking because the black and white picture of native, non-native, right, that they'd learned was being all messed up. Now, after about probably halfway through, the military took over and started showing, oh, they have all this paramilitary equipment, but they would still show the other side. And apparently after this, where the media recorded on this for 71 days, and showed, as I say, so much of the complexity of Native communities, apparently support for the settling of Native land claims skyrocketed. Over 50% of Canadians felt that justice should be served for Native people. That ended. Nowadays, when there was, they were reclaiming land at Six Nations near Toronto, all they showed was a day when the OPP came in and people were fighting the OPP. Most often when they say there's some Native unrest about something, they will show 20 seconds of men sitting around a big drum, pounding the drum. They will report briefly and it'll be gone. All you're ever going to get now in the media is 5-second blurbs. And the reason they do that is because they realized when they reported, as I say, the military took over halfway through when we were reporting, oh, they have all these weapons, But for half of it, they were showing Native realities. And now they don't do that. So media has shut down on any real reporting of any of the issues that Native communities face because they don't want Canadian support. And from that time, in 1990, Canadians were supporting it all over the place. So if you've never heard anything, it's deliberate. Oh, I think the only other reconciliation thing is the citizenship oath. We'll now have to mention Native people. I think that's, again, you can do that without addressing anything structural, So yeah, anyway. Yep, we've got a bit more time. One last one.
Don't know if you can hear me. Is that okay? Thank you for your words. I really appreciate your talk. I want to sort of the through
threads that I picked up in what you were saying was this idea of mobility as being part of the issue behind some of the criminalization and some of the sort of pathology behind Indigenous mobility. What I think about is with missing and murdered Indigenous women, so often the mobility of these women is part of the reason that they're treated as deviant and therefore at least partially to blame for their own victimization. So the case that interests me is hitchhiking along the Highway of Tears, and that when an Indigenous sex trade worker hitchhikes, that's a very particular deviance in mobility.
Actually, just community women.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, no sex trade involved.
Yeah.
Just community women.
Yeah.
Go on. Yeah.
And also in terms of, you know, the pass system through the Indian Act, and also registration, and the idea that for Indigenous people to have permission to move, there was always sort of this criminalization of mobility. It was always either the wrong form of mobility or too much mobility, you know, even the call of northern sled dogs. So I'm sort of interested in how you sort of view mobility as being sort of central in terms of this idea of criminalization, and how sort of modern policy responses and the idea of reconciliation sort of interrupts or maybe supports this idea of mobility being problematic.
Well, I think that I know that in Western Canada, in particular, I mean, when I was 19, back in 1971, I can recall hitching out west, and at that point, most of the people I run into were people who'd come down from reserves, right? Then in the 1980s, largely because of the fact that, and later and onwards, because they weren't building houses on reserves, large numbers of Native people started coming to the cities. And I say Western Canada, and because that, like Northern Ontario, is segregated, right? So white people could grow up their whole lives without ever really seeing a Native person, and suddenly there's Native people everywhere as far as they're concerned. So I think that mobility, there's definitely a challenge about being out of place. But the other side of mobility is not having anything at home. There's no universities on reserves, right? Actually, I mean, First Nations University used to be Saskatchewan Indian Federation colleges, so that's in Regina. You know, I mean, there's no hospitals. Well, Moose Factory had a hospital there, but they also had a residential school there. So, you know, it's the absence of viable community life which makes a lot of people move. A lot of people move for education. A lot of women move from losing Indian status in the past, right? All kinds of reasons. The 60s scoop, right? All those things. Residential school. All of those things separated people. So, I mean, mobility is both a curse and our right? Our right to be anywhere. So I'm not sure about, you know, whether you can sort of view it for the lens of policing or not. I think that, and in terms of missing and murdered women, I think that, especially with the Highway of Tears, I mean, we're talking poverty. Not everybody has a car, right? So yeah, I'm not sure about that, you know, I think mobility is an issue, but it's also not a, there's a lot of things involved. Thank you.